This conference will now be recorded.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the South Carolina State Library's webinar, which is titled Creating Inclusive and Reflective Library Collections. I'm Caroline Smith, the Inclusive Services Consultant at the State Library, and I will be your moderator in this series. Our speaker today is Sandra Hughes Hassel. She's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill School of Information and Library Science and a past president of the Young Adult Library Services Association. Her research and teaching focuses on equity and inclusion in youth services librarianship, and she's the co-creator of Project Ready, Reimagining Equity and Access for Diverse Youth, which is a free online series of professional development. Before we begin, we have a couple housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed out to everyone who is registered and available on the State Library's YouTube channel. And during the presentation, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and I will compile those questions, and hopefully we'll have time at the end of the webinar to make sure all of those are answered. And with that, I will turn it over to Sandra.
Okay, welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining the discussion today. Today I'm going to be talking to you about how to create inclusive and reflective library collections. And I understand from Carolyn that this is the first in a series, so I hope what I'll do today is provide you with some information that you'll be able to use right now, but also that some of the information I provide to you will also serve as a foundation for what is going to come next in the subsequent sessions that you will have. So here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. I want to start off by giving a brief demographic snapshot of the United States. Then I'm going to talk about the characteristics of effective library collections for diverse youth. Spend some time talking about the benefits of collecting diverse literature, how to create a diverse collection, give some pointers for that, and then I'm just going to spend a very few minutes at the end talking about how to promote diverse books. So I'm going to start with this quote from Melinda Lowe. And I think this is a really important quote because it reminds us that focusing on diversity, as she says, is not praiseworthy. It is our reality. If you consider these facts, it kind of speaks to why this is the reality of our youth today in the United States. 47% of the youth in the United States are children and teens of color. Our public schools in 2015 became majority youth of color, so that's as a whole. It might not be in your community, but across the country, youth of color now make up the majority of youth in our schools. More than 1 in 4 of America's 74 million children grow up in immigrant households. I think it's important that we understand that the majority of immigrant youth are American citizens. 70% of these young people speak Spanish. However, as a group across the country, English language learners speak nearly 150 languages. And of course, it varies from state to state and community to community. Almost 1/4 of the children who live in the United States are living in low-income families. 1 in 6 of those children grow up in poverty. We have a much higher incidence of homelessness among our children and teens than we've ever had in the past. I didn't provide that statistic, but it's out there for you to look at. 8% of all high school students in America identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. The numbers for young children who identify as LGBTQ are hard to come by, but there was one study that was done that said 1% of 9-year-olds identify as LGBTQ. We know that today's young people have a very different understandings of gender than previous generations. Many of them view gender as occurring on a spectrum rather than occurring as a binary. They use gender non-specific pronouns like they and them as opposed to he and her. And in 2017-2018, in that school year, the number of students aged 3 to 21 who received special education services was 7.3 million, or 14% of all public school students. So nationally, if we take a look at these statistics, we can see that we are more diverse than we've ever been as a country. In your communities, your own communities, the types of diversity that is there may vary, but there's still diversity among the youth that all of us serve. Sometimes that diversity may be sort of invisible to us. So for example, there may be students that we are serving, youth that you're serving in your public library who self-identify as LGBTQ, but they haven't come out to their parents or to their peers. There may be young people who have disabilities that are invisible to us. So perhaps there's autistic people in our community, children that you're serving in your libraries that you may not be aware of. But in every community, there is diversity. And so that's important for us to consider. It's there, whether it's visible to us or not. Unfortunately, in American society, the youth who reflect the demographic characteristics that I've just talked about, so our Black youth, Indigenous youth, youth of color, youth who identify as LGBTQ, disabled youth, English language learners, often they're immigrants, youth from low-income families have traditionally been marginalized and pushed to the edges of society. They often face disparities that limit their access to resources and opportunities. And in many communities, they've been silenced and excluded. And I know this is a really big statement, and unfortunately, I don't have time to unpack it for you, but if you'll go to the Project Ready website there, you'll find the data that supports this statement, and you'll also find more about the inequities that young people from marginalized communities face, both in our public school system, healthcare, education, and also within, unfortunately, some libraries in our community. But I wanted to put this statement out there because it really underlies a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So we have a lot of diversity, and unfortunately, in some communities, this diversity is not welcomed and not recognized. So for the past decade, my colleagues here at UNC and I have been conducting research on what effective library services for diverse youth might look like. And this is the infographic that we've come up with. And we have identified 5 components of effective library services for diverse youth. So the spaces need to be affirming, respectful, responsive, comfortable, welcoming, and flexible. The policies, we need to be thinking about those. They need to be context-specific, explicit, equitable, collaborative, student-centered, and compassionate. We as staff members need to have a certain set of characteristics. We need to show our young people that we are caring, that we are encouraging, that we're committed, that we hold ourselves accountable for making sure that they feel welcome and that they have the resources that they need in the library. We need to be courageous advocates for them, and we need to be culturally competent. Effective library instruction and programming, bottom line here, you can see that instruction or the programs that we have in our public libraries need to be challenging, engaging, authentic, relevant, student-centered, and culturally sustaining and collaborative. So today we're going to talk about these effective library collections. And we've got these 6 adjectives that describe what those collections look like. So meaningful, that they help diverse youth understand themselves and their world. Reflective, the collections positively and accurately represent the diverse youth. They're validating, they affirm that diversity is of value to us as a society, and they as individuals are of value to us as members of our communities. The collections are relevant. They are relating to the lived experiences of our diverse youth. They're enabling. This is a term that Dr. Tatum developed, this idea of enabling, that they empower diverse youth to make positive change in their own lives and in their own communities. And finally, they need to be inclusive so that they're reflecting the broadest possible spectrum of diversity in terms of the content that's in these resources, as well as the authors, illustrators, and so forth of the resources. Before we talk about how to build collections that reflect these characteristics, however, I want to step back and I want to talk about why. I think it's really important that we talk about why library collections for diverse youth must be meaningful, reflective, validating, relevant, enabling, and inclusive. What benefits does having diverse collections provide for the young people in our communities? Many of you are probably familiar with this quote from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. Dr. Bishop conducted some of the early research that showed the need for books that represented the lived experiences of youth who belong to marginalized communities. Her research specifically looked at books that represented the African American experience, the Black experience in the United States. So as a result of her research, Dr. Bishop concluded that sometimes books are windows. So they give us a view into a world. It could be the real world, or it could be an imagined world. It could be a world that we're already familiar with, or it could be a world that we are just being introduced to. She says that sometimes these windows become sliding glass doors. So a book becomes a sliding glass door when it invites the reader to walk into that world and to become part of that world that's being either created or recreated by an author. But she also says that when lighting conditions are right, a window can also be a mirror. And that's really what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is this idea of diverse literature as a mirror. And I want to read the bottom of this quote to you because I think this is so important that we keep this in mind. Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we see our own lives and experiences as part of the larger human experience. Reading then becomes a means of self-affirmation, and readers often seek their mirrors in books. And I think the words that are so important to me in this quote are this whole idea that in books, that our young people need to see their lives and their experiences reflected back to them. Because when they see that, it does two things. One, it increases their sense of self, provides self-affirmation for them, but also lets them see that they're part of a bigger community. This whole idea they're part of this larger human experience. They're valuable in our larger society. And so I think that this keeping this idea of mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors is really important, but understanding the why behind it. So I'm going to share with you some research that shows that marginalized identity youth, so the youth who belong to the communities that I share demographics about, so our Black, Indigenous, youth of color, our disabled youth, youth identified as LGBTQ, youth who come from low-income families. This research shows that having diverse literature in libraries, in our classrooms, in our homes, in the spaces that our children and teens visit, has positive experiences on their lives. I'm going to highlight just a couple of these. The first one is that, just like Dr. Bishop says, it validates their existence and lived experiences. So Dr. Bishop made her statement in the 1990s. Since 1990, there's actually been research conducted that shows that, yes, this is true, that when young people who belong to marginalized communities see themselves in the literature that they are experiencing, it validates their existence, and it also validates how they live their lives, and that the way that they live their lives is as important as the way other people live their lives. It also connects them with their textual lineage and history. It provides images of the achievement of members of marginalized communities. I went to school a really long time ago. Some of you are maybe more recent graduates from high school, but much of the history that we are formally taught in schools didn't when I went to school, and still doesn't do this. A lot of it is very Eurocentric and middle class. If we hear about the contributions of African Americans, for example, or Asian Americans, or people who belong to the LGBTQ community, or people with disabilities, it's rare, and often it's only during special months. So we might hear about Latino families, Latinx community during Hispanic Heritage Month, and that's the only time we ever hear about their contributions. We might hear about African Americans only during Black History Month, and a lot of times we hear about the same ones over and over and over. It's a very narrow number of people that we hear from. So by having this diverse literature in our collections, sharing it with our young people, we're able to connect them to their history. They have a very rich history in our country. They have in many ways contributed many ways to our society. And so by having this diversity in our literature, we allow our young people from these marginalized communities to connect with that lineage, to connect with their history, to see and be proud of what their community has accomplished. It also counters the single story. If you haven't seen the Adichie, oh, now I can't remember her name, but if you haven't seen the video, The Danger of a Single Story, you need to watch that. And in that, she talks about the fact that there are all these myths and stereotypes that are held by the dominant culture, and that when we see when diverse youth see themselves in our literature, it helps to counter that single story. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And then finally, it provides healing from the damages of living in this quote, it's a racist society. That's Barker did her research looking at racism, but it's also would provide damages from living in a society or a community that's homophobic, that's ableist, that's xenophobic. So any of those unfortunate ways that young people experience our society, it can provide them with healing from the damages that are caused by living in that kind of community. So what about the youth who belong to the dominant culture? So in our country, the dominant culture is people who are white, cishet, meaning they're cisgender and heterosexual. They're able-bodied, they speak English as their first or their only language. What about diversity for those young people? So Nancy Larrick was another researcher who early on looked at diversity in the publishing industry. And she found that the majority of the books published, and this was in 1965, featured white youth, families, and communities. I'm going to show you some data in a second that's going to show that that has not changed. That even though we're in 2019 and we're a more diverse community than we've ever been as a society, the majority of our books still feature white youth, families, and communities. And so from her research, she made this conclusion, that when the only images children see are white, as long as children are brought up on what she calls gentle doses of racism through their books, because they only see themselves and if they're white children, they only see themselves and they see themselves in a superior position, there seems to be little chance of developing the humility so urgently needed for world cooperation. So she, in her research, was saying, yes, it benefits our youth of color, but it also is important for our white youth, because it's important for all of us to understand how we come together as a community, how we are all valuable, how we all play a role in our society. So again, some of the research that supports this claim is this idea that when our youth who belong to the dominant culture see others who they share a different identity than themselves, that it begins to challenge those stereotypes that they may have. It begins to encourage them to question the perceptions that they're hearing around them, and to really begin to think about, well, what are people who belong to an identity different from mine really like? I have these misperceptions, I have these stereotypes, but these books are helping open my mind and ask me to think about things in a different way. Again, just like I said before, for the youth of color, the same thing for our youth who belong to the dominant culture. When they read books that represent diverse communities, it introduces them to the textual lineage and historical and current social contributions of our marginalized communities to our society. And finally, it helps our youth who belong to the dominant culture understand what life is like for others and invite the reader into this new and unfamiliar world. So that idea that Bishop talks about of books being windows and hopefully sliding glass doors. So finally, diverse literature benefits all youth. So we've talked a little bit about some specific ways it benefits our youth who belong to marginalized communities, a little bit about how it benefits youth who belong to dominant culture, but also benefits all of our young people. It supports identity-safe classrooms or identity-safe libraries, and that's been shown by research to increase academic achievement. So we talk a lot about the gaps in academic achievement between different groups. Having diverse literature helps to create classrooms where all children are able to be more successful academically. It leads to the reduction in stereotyping. some of the things we've just been talking about. It leads to more positive feelings about people who represent identities other than your own. It increases their desire to want to come into contact with each other. For some of our youth and some of our communities, it may be the only time they have contact with people from an identity that's different from their own, or that they can see as different from their own. And so it helps to reduce those stereotypes. It helps our young people learn how to collaborate and communicate with people across different cultural groups. And we know that that's a key 21st century skill. And finally, it provides a space for our youth to talk about race, ethnicity, gender identification, sexual orientation, and disability in a transformative way. A lot of times it's easier to talk about these kinds of issues when you're talking about a character in a book than it is when you're talking about something that's just happened in your community. We should be doing both, but the literature often gives our youth a way into that conversation that allows them to have those discussions. So I'm sharing this why with you for a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's really important to understand the positive impact that diverse youth or diverse literature can have on diverse youth. It's not a gimmick. It's not just being politically correct. Diverse youth has tangible results for our youth who are often marginalized in the United States. So the impact that it has is real. It makes a difference in their lives. And it's important for that reason. It's also important that we understand how diverse literature benefits youth who belong to the dominant culture. Youth who are white or cisgender or heterosexual or able-bodied or middle class. Too often I will hear people say, but my community is homogeneous. I don't need to worry about buying diverse literature. But the research shows that this is far from the truth. As the research that I just shared with you on this slide and the slide before shows, having diverse literature benefits all youth in substantial ways. So even if someone in your community says, well, this community is homogeneous, we don't need these resources, the young people that are in that community, even if they don't belong to those diverse identities, also need those resources. And finally, I'm sharing this research with you. And at the end of the slideshow, you'll find all the citations for the research, because sometimes it's our colleagues or our library directors or our library board or other people in the community that we need to convince that we need to be spending our money on collecting diverse titles. So I share this research with you to give you a tool that you can put in your toolbox to use as you move forward in your work. So now that we understand why, how do we go about developing these collections? So the first thing we have to do is find it. So many of you are probably already familiar with this data and maybe even with this infographic. For decades, the Cooperative Children's Book Center, which is at the University of University of Wisconsin at Madison, has been collecting statistics on the number of children's books published each year that are by and about people of color and Native peoples. So starting in 2014, we began to see the number of diverse books grow. But as this infographic shows, we still need to make improvement. So this infographic was developed by David Hayek and Sarah Park-Dalen, and it depicts the 2018 data. So differences in representation among different cultural groups are highlighted by the mirrors. So the larger and the more mirrors means that there's more representation. So if you can take a look at this infographic, you would still see that today, in 2019, 50% of the books that were published in 2018 were about white children, white communities, and white families. Alarmingly, if you look at this carefully, you'll see that the percentage of books by and about people of color and Natives people combined, when you put all of that together, and we know that's 47% of our population in the United States. 47% of our population is only represented by 23% of the books. 27% of the books published in 2018 were about animals or other things. Okay, so just kind of think about that for a second. We know that 47% of our children are from communities of color. Yet in 2018, only 23% of the books represented their lived experiences, their lives, their communities, their textual lineage, their history, their contributions to American society. I want you to think about the message that this sends to these young people about whose story is important to tell, who in our society is important enough to have stories told about. And then I also want you to think about how that erases the richness of their lives. So it's not only that you're not there, but when you're not there, you've been erased. The history of your life, the richness of your life, the richness of your community has essentially been erased by the publishing industry. On the next two slides, I'm going to highlight some of the resources that I've found helpful in locating diverse text. It's really important to remember that while our standard reviewing tools like Booklist, School Library Journal, Kirkus have gotten better, they're reviewing more books that we would call diverse books, books that represent the lives of youth in our community, youth in our communities who belong to marginalized communities. It's not enough to rely on them again. They still don't feature enough, and even though they're working to educate their reviewers about how to actually do reviewing of books that they're not about a community to which they don't belong, to which they may not be familiar with, often the reviews are still problematic. So we need to kind of expand the resources that we use when we're attempting to intentionally create these diverse collections. So I'm just going to highlight a couple here. One of the things that's really important to do is follow blogs. And here I've listed a number of blogs from Disability and Kidlit to the Brown Bookshelf to I'm Here, I'm Queer, What the Hell Do I Read? These blogs are usually and most often maintained and by people who belong to the communities that belong to those communities. So for example, the Latinx and Kidlit blog is maintained and run by people who belong to the Latinx community. So the reviews on this are credible. They're looking at these books from a different perspective. They're looking at books that they want to either celebrate or books that they want to tell us to avoid because these books perpetuate misconceptions or stereotypes. So following these different blogs is important. Also, if you're not familiar with the last one is Teaching Tolerance, which is part of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. They have, they call it student text because it's oriented towards teachers, their materials are, but it's a great database that you can go into and search for different diverse titles. So it's a great place to go in and find, you know, all kinds of titles that you can then think about purchasing for your public library collection. The Cooperative Children's Book Center, which is the organization that keeps track of the data around diversity, also has a searchable database. Again, it's kind of it's not a flashy database, but it works well. You can go in there and you can search by identity. So you could search, say, for books about African Americans. You can search by level. So I want books for toddlers, and you can search by some other different features. So that's another good searchable database that you can go back into. Also, the We Need Diverse Books has a page called Where to Define Diverse Books. And on that page, they give lists of publishers, they give lists of small presses, they give lists of awards, different blogs to follow, and so forth. One of the things that we do know in looking for diverse books, and again, it has gotten better, more of the mainstream publishers, more of the mainstream vendors are providing access to these books, but we still often and should be going to small presses, because a lot of times the small presses are led by people who belong to the community. And so not only are we making sure we're getting books that are authentic and reflective, but we're also financially supporting the community that has traditionally been marginalized. If you're active on social media, I found that Twitter is a great professional resource. You can follow authors, you can follow publishers, and you can follow members of marginalized identity communities. You can also follow hashtags like ownvoices or We Need Diverse Books or Disrupt Text. If you don't know Disrupt Text, that hashtag, it's a group that's working to disrupt the canon, the traditional canon. Again, just like in our history classes, we don't necessarily learn the history of communities, unless they're white, Eurocentric. Same thing happens in our English language arts classrooms. Many of the books that our young people are reading are written by white authors, often old dead white men, as everybody says. And so Disrupt Text is saying, no, there's other voices out there, there are other stories that are worthy that we need to be bringing into the canon in our classroom. So this is a good hashtag to follow as well. Another thing that we need to think about when we are collecting diverse literature is that we want to move beyond the big four. The big four are our award winners. Yes, we want to have our award winners, but that's not enough. It's not enough when we're collecting diverse texts just to take those award winners and order those books. We want to move beyond issue books, books that only deal with problems. So, for example, LGBTQ books that only deal with coming out or only deal with coming out in a negative way. We want to move beyond historical fiction. People live in today's world. It's not just a historical event. African Americans live today. They didn't just live during slavery. And biographies. So of course we want those, but we also need just books, fantasy, romance, mysteries that feature diverse characters. I like this quote from Jerry Craft, who's an author, where he says, too many books for kids of color are biographies about slavery and the civil rights movement. If the only books that white kids had were on Thomas Jefferson and Teddy Roosevelt, then maybe they wouldn't be so excited about reading either. And I think this is a really sobering quote to keep in mind when we're thinking about, well, why aren't our Latinx youth reading? Well, maybe they're not reading because there aren't any books in the library, or there are very few books in the library where they see themselves, where they see their community conveyed in a positive way. So just like we want, we want a wide range of books that represents every community, not just one community. And that takes me to the next slide. So when we're collecting diverse literature, it's not enough to have 1 or 2 or 3 titles that, for example, represent, as I said, the LGBTQ youth and their experiences. No community is monolithic. There is no one book that can represent or should represent any community's experiences. Similarly, youth have multiple identities. They may be Latino and bisexual and live in a low-income community. They might be African American, middle class, and live in the suburbs. They might be disabled and Filipino. So we need to be intentional in creating a collection that represents a wide range of youth identities and experiences. So just consider these 4 examples here. All of these books on the screen here are young adult titles that feature protagonists and support characters who belong to the Latinx community. So Julie, who's in Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter, she's the daughter of Mexican immigrants. Okay, so we have one experience of the Mexican community, Mexican American community expressed in this book. She is the daughter of Mexican immigrants. Then we have Sierra in Shadow Shaper. She's a painter. She's a shadow shaper. She's of African and Puerto Rican descent living in New York City. Aristotle and Dante is historical fiction. Okay, Shadow Shaper is fantasy. Aristotle and Dante is historical fiction. Okay, it's about Aristotle and Dante. They're both Mexican American. It's set in El Paso, Texas, and it's a love story. And then they both die in the end. We have Mateo, who's Puerto Rican and gay, and we have Rufus, who's Cuban American and bisexual. It's set kind of in contemporary New York. They're both dying, but they fall in love. So these 4 books demonstrate the diversity, a tiny bit of the diversity that's within this one community, a diversity that needs to be represented across our collection. So it's not enough to have 1 book or 2 books or 3 books. We need to have lots of books about diverse communities within our collection, because these communities are so varied. They are not monolithic. They're varied individuals live within communities, and so we need to reflect as broad a range of experiences as we can. Another thing that we need to remember is that not all diverse titles are created equal, and so just because a book is labeled diverse, just because it features a marginalized identity, young person, or their community, doesn't mean that the representation is accurate or authentic. Unfortunately, misrepresentation and perpetuation of stereotypes of marginalized communities continues to be a problem. So all of the books on this slide are about Native Americans. They're also all written by people who don't belong to the Native American community. Okay? So we have people who don't belong to the community writing the stories of those communities. These 4 books that I have here, they misrepresent the experiences of the Native American community, and they all perpetuate harmful stereotypes. So again, just because a book is labeled diverse doesn't mean that it's a book that we want to buy for our collection. What to do with these books once we have them is another discussion, but it's something to think about, because these books are harmful to young people who belong to the communities that are being depicted. They're also harmful to youth who don't have those identities, because they're perpetuating these stereotypes. And I want to share one specific example with you that kind of explains this a little bit more. So we're going to take a look at Skippy John Jones. This is a series that perpetuates well-known stereotypes of Mexican American people. And I have linked here the blog post that Beverly Slavin wrote. It's titled Skippy John Jones, Transforming a Racist Stereotype into an Industry. And in this blog post, Slavin argues, or actually she traces the legacy of ethnic and cultural misrepresentation that Skippy John Jones builds on. And so I'm going to share a little bit of this with you just for a few minutes. So Slavin talks about how in 1953, Speedy Gonzales came along. So some of you, I'm old enough to remember Speedy. If you're not, he was a cartoon mouse. He had the ability to run really fast, and he had an exaggerated Mexican accent. He wore an oversized yellow sombrero, a white shirt and pants, red bandana. He ran around in circles, chasing his nemesis, Sylvester the cat, who he called the Gringo Pusicato, while shouting, "Arriba, arriba, andal, andal, yeehaw." In 1967, the Frito Bandito came along. This was the cartoon mascot for the Fritos corn chips. Again, this mascot was dressed as a Mexican bandit, and it sang to the tune of the traditional Mexican song, Celita Linda, ay, 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 OIMD, Frito Bandito, I like Fritos corn chips, I love them, I do, I want Fritos corn chips, I'll take them from you. Then in 1997, we had the Taco Bell Chihuahua. He was a real Chihuahua who was sometimes costumed as a Mexican revolutionary. Sometimes he was a sombrero wearing a bandito, and sometimes he was just a street smart Chihuahua. So Slavin argues that while Speedy Gonzales, Frito Bandito, the Taco Bell Chihuahua are no longer in our pop culture, they're no longer part of our lineage, I guess one might say, their legacy lives on in Skippy John Jones. Skippy John Jones is a cat who transforms himself into a Chihuahua, and he throws around made-up Spanish words. So as Slavin points out, the books are condescending and mocking to Mexican and Mexican American people and the Spanish language. I want you to imagine what it would be like to be a Mexican or a Mexican American child and hear this story being read aloud during story hour. To hear it praised and recommended by librarians, teachers, other adults. Sometimes it might even be the only book that's in the collection that represents your culture. Think about what that feels like. If you think back to the quote that I shared from Nancy Lyric, I want you to also think about what hearing this book during story hour says to a child who is not Mexican or Mexican American about Mexican communities and culture. Just think about the implications that reading a book like this, having a book like this, promoting a book like this has for young people who belong to the Mexican American culture, as well as those who don't. So this is an example of a book, while it's labeled diverse, it's a book we want to think about deeply, question critically, and ask ourselves, is this the representation of the Mexican American community that we want in our library collections? Most of you are probably all familiar with the Own Voices and Kidlit hashtag. It developed in direct response to the continuation and continued publishing and promotion of books that perpetuate stereotypes. It was created by the author Connie DeVis to recommend books about diverse characters that are written by people who share those identities. And the idea behind this Own Voices is that the quality of a story is improved when the person creating the story is an insider who knows what to share and how to share it with outsiders. Okay, and that's important too. It's a story told by an insider who knows how to tell that story to other insiders, but also knows what to share and how to share with outsiders. Everything in every culture is not meant to be shared, nor should it be shared. And so when books are written by insiders in those communities, they are able to share what is okay to be shared and know how to share it in ways that are respectful and speak to all communities. Own Voices has actually become a movement calling for library staff to purchase books by marginalized authors and illustrators, books that authentically and accurately portray their lives. So to kind of push back on the publishing industry's continued focus on, in some areas, of having white authors write about communities that they did not belong to, or and so this whole idea of let's buy our books that are written by marginalized authors and illustrators. Some other collection-related considerations that we have to think about. So up in the right-hand corner, I have coming out in 2020 a book called Collection Management for Youth. It's a second edition of a book that I did with Dr. Jackie Mancall, and the focus of this book will be on equity. And in this book, as we're I talk about as we're developing diverse collections, we also need to not just buy them, bring them in, but we also need to revisit our collection development policy. We need to conduct a collection audit. Let's find out what we already have or what we don't have. We need to prioritize within our collection development policy that creating an equitable collection is a goal of our collection development. When we set something aside as a goal, then it provides us with the rationale to move that forward. We need to expand our review resources to include these non-traditional resources that I've talked about. A lot of collection development policies say, a book, in order to be considered for the collection, a resource has to have X number of reviews from standard selection tools. Well, that's not going to work if we're trying to collect books that are written by small presses, if we're trying to collect books that are written by many Own Voices authors. So we need to expand our list of review resources to include those blogs, to include things like the Cooperative Center for Children's Books. We need to update our reconsideration policy. In your community, you may, if you bring in books that represent LGBTQ, the lives of your LGBTQ youth and their families, these books may open the door for challenges. We need to look at our reconsideration policy and make sure that we have a policy in place that's going to support bringing these books in and also support the libraries in making these decisions. And then we also need to revise our reading criteria. As I said, kind of figure out what am I going to do with a book that I now know is actually harmful to all of my children, all of my youth. What am I going to do with that resource now that I've gotten it? We also need to, in our collection-related considerations, think about our budgeting decisions. Again, we need to prioritize equity in purchasing. We need to make a commitment to buying diverse Own Voices text. We need to expand our list of vendors to include small presses. That's just going to be absolutely necessary, or to also include independent stores in your community. And we may have to seek grant funding beyond what we get in our library budgets to diversify the collection. So these are some other collection-related things that we need to be thinking about in developing these inclusive and diverse collections. And finally, I just want to spend a few minutes on talking about promoting these diverse books. It's not enough that we just have them. We need to be promoting them year round, and as our research has shown, with all teens, just like we would do, or all, sorry, I work with teens, so teens is here, but with all youth, just like we would any other title. Our displays should explicitly highlight the library's support of our youth who belong to diverse and often marginalized communities. This is an example of one from one of school librarians here in Wake County. She's in a middle school. As our knowledge of these titles grows, we need to be intentional in our efforts to incorporate them into our reader's advisory. So here's an example. Do you have youth who are fantasy lovers? Here's some examples of the books that we can reach for, and all representing diverse identities. Another example, maybe the youth in your library like post-apocalyptia. That may be more popular. So here's some examples of some titles that we could recommend for youth who like those types of books. Have a student who's really into the Hunger Games, instead of just representing or recommending something like Divergent or Delirium or Matched, how about Book Talk, Killer of the Enemies? Have a teen who's graduating from Wimpy Kid years, hand them the Great Green Heist. And so when we know the books, then we're able to be intentional in the reader's advisory that we do to get those books in all teens' hands, to make all of our teens aware of these wonderful books and the power of these stories. In addition to being intentional with our reader's advisory, we also need to assess all of our programming, including our book clubs, our summer reading lists, our classroom book talks, to make sure that we are promoting diverse titles. You may have heard of Project Lit. It's a book club that was started by an English teacher, Jared Amato, in 2016, and his goal was to increase access to high quality, culturally relevant books, to promote a love of reading, and to spark the difficult conversations that are necessary to affect change in schools and communities. And he is in East Nashville, Tennessee. Another positive outcome of Project Lit is that it empowers students to gain meaningful ways to engage with their communities in meaningful ways with books like All American Boys, The Hate U Give. The program started, as I said, in 2016 in East Nashville. It's now spread to more than 500 classrooms and school libraries across the country, and it could easily be implemented in a public library. If nothing else, the books that are being recommended and read through the Project Lit Book Club would be great books to add to our collection. So another selection tool per se. We also want to make sure that our reading lists are diverse. This is a great resource. It's put out every year. It's called We Are Kidlit Collective Summer Reading List. I think they've been creating this list for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's just an amazing list of books for summer reading. So what do youth of color say? I have a colleague, she's a former student who did some action research with the three young students at her school. She's a middle school librarian. They're pictured there on the right. It's Jada, Jose, and now I've forgotten his name. I'm sorry, and I know his name. Anyway, the 3 of them, and then Julie's in that picture. And she had them do some action research about what would inclusive libraries look like. If their library was inclusive, if they could tell librarians 5 things about what to do to make the library inclusive, what would those 5 things be? And so the first one, as you can see, is see me, listen to me. Know I'm there in your community. I'm there. I may not be in the library, but I'm in the community. See me, seek me out, find out what it is I want, what resources I'm looking for. Show me on the shelves and walls. Read those books yourselves. So it's not enough just to have them. We need to, as we said, display them, put them everywhere, and make sure you've read those books so that you can recommend them. Graphic novels and manga are not extra. This is really important to them, that manga and graphic novels be centered to our collections and not just extras. Show the joy in our stories. Gets back to go beyond the big 4. Don't just collect issue books. Don't just collect historical fiction. show our joy, the joy of our lives, and then make the library a sorting-free zone, a place where we don't come into and feel like we're being labeled, that we're being sorted, that we're being judged. So finally, last slide, to create a diverse collection, it requires equity-informed thinking. We need to ask ourselves, does the current collection at my library reflect the diversity represented in my community? So that's that idea of that life audit. Ask yourself specifically whose images, voices, lived experiences, histories, and cultures are missing. Does the current collection in my library provide opportunities for youth who belong to the dominant culture to understand what life is like for others who don't share their identity? To again, introduce them to the historical and social contributions of marginalized communities. What are the barriers that are preventing me from developing a collection that represents youth from diverse communities? How can I reduce these barriers? And finally, how can I work authentically with communities, marginalized communities, to build this collection, to create this collection that's going to be meant for them to represent their lives, working collaboratively with that community, not making decisions for them, but involving them within our decision making. The last two slides just have some resources for you. The Project Ready curriculum that we talked about, it's an online professional development curriculum. It expands on all the ideas that I've talked about here. And then, as I said, I have forthcoming in 2020 the collection, It Should Be Management for learners, that will also have an equity focus. So now I see we have a little bit of time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Sandra. And if anyone has questions, you can type them in the chat box, and you're also welcome to turn on your microphone if you wish. And we'll give you a couple minutes to type. While we wait, I have a question, Sandra, about one area that I've found or seen in other libraries that can be difficult is with collections in other languages that may not circulate as frequently as English language books. And what are your recommendations for how to advocate for purchasing those materials when the circulation statistics are lower?
I think in general in libraries we need to move beyond just looking at things like circulation statistics as a rationale for including books in the collection, and really think about impact, outcome. The whole idea of it's outcomes-based evaluation. So really thinking about that piece of it. So maybe it's not going to circulate, but that shouldn't be the only criteria that we use for determining whether a book like that needs to be in our collection.
And Liz asked if they can have a copy of the slideshow. Is that something we can email out?
Sure. Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's in Google Docs, so definitely I intentionally put a lot of information on the slides so that you would have that as you move forward. And then there is a bibliography, as I said. And all the links hopefully are live. And my contact information is at the very end, and if anybody has any questions, or if you want to follow me on Twitter.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I'm going to switch this over to my screen.
Can I just say one thing? First of all, just if everybody gets a chance when you get the slides, take a look at, if you don't know this poem, You Don't Even Know Me by Sharon Flake. This is being performed by a group of young African American men, and it's really powerful, and I think really speaks to the importance of having diverse literature in our collections. Just a perfect example. So, okay, thanks, Carolyn.
Okay, so let's see. So this was the first in a series of webinars, and in about 3 weeks actually, on September 10th, will be the next session with our guest speaker, Jennifer Baker, who was the creator of the podcast Minorities in Publishing, and she will go into detail on what we see and don't see perspectives and tropes. So you can register for that session. We should have some more sessions coming up in the later on in the fall as well. And my contact information is here if you'd like to discuss anything with me. I'm available for support for any library staff in South Carolina. And you can also visit the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Libraries LibGuide for some other good resources. And I will also email out an evaluation survey to anyone who is registered at this event. Thank you so much, Sandra, for your presentation, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Carolyn, for inviting me, and it's nice to meet everyone.
All right.